Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be taking a look at the relationship between, or among really, China, Russia, and the United States. My guest has a new book on this topic. My guest today is Dr. Gregg Hall. Dr. Hall is an associate professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, USA. His most recent book is Examining U.S.-China-Russia Foreign Relations, Great Power Politics in a Post-Obama Era. Dr. Gregg Hall, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Good morning, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being with me, Greg. Let's get right into it and start with your book. Why did you decide to write the book now? It's very timely. You probably couldn't have picked a better time to do it, but why did you decide to do it, and what's the main thrust of it?
Sure. Well, it's interesting talking about timing of it all. This book was to be out and done and in print at least a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. But the twists and turns of COVID and delays and distractions, that wasn't to be. But I think it's actually a fuller work, a more useful work, with the delays that we saw due to COVID distractions and everything. This is actually a sort of a follow-on of a 2014 study that looked at what I call the big three: U.S., Russia, China, and their interrelationship. And as we got into the 1990s, the late 1990s, it became clearer and clearer that Russia and China and their bilateral relationship were sort of on one trajectory, and the U.S., with its respective bilateral relationships with China and Russia, was on another trajectory. And so I argued in that initial book that this so-called strategic triangle did not end after the Cold War, did not dissolve, if you will, and it's taken twists and turns. It's evolving, and it's evolving in line with an evolving world order. We call it towards multipolarity or a messy bipolarity, whatever. And so that's really the sort of the thinking, the thrust behind the initial book, and it is that this triangle really did not dissolve, but now, and that the individual players in the respective domestic environments are coming more and more to the fore in the relationship, and particularly in the triangular relationship.
Exactly, they certainly are. Yes. Well, I don't think anybody would argue that the U.S. is certainly a superpower. China is coming on very strong.
Oh, yes.
There's no doubt about that. Especially economy, build up of its military, that type of thing. The thing is with the Russians, though, is we've seen that they have been a tremendous disappointment to the Russians, not to the Ukrainians or anyone else, but to the Russians in their lackluster operation in Ukraine. They have not done well. We just saw that just a few days ago that Putin's power was being challenged, although the leader of the Wagner group said that he was going to really just challenge the military people. I'm sorry, the Wagner group. I'm sorry, not Wagner. Wagner group, that he was going to challenge the military people. And anyway, he was indirectly challenging Putin. But what makes Russia still a superpower today? And we can argue that it is to some degree, I think.
And it's an important argument and debate to have. Even as I was preparing the 2014 manuscript, there were reviewers who challenged me strongly on that point, that clearly Russia was diminished after the breakup of the USSR. There was a growing sort of democratizing force within the country, although that's pretty much been stamped out now, at least any organized opposition. And so, why Russia? I contend first and foremost, Bill, that they're nuclear power, strategic nuclear forces. They have global reach. highly developed in terms of their rocket capability and missiles, and they've helped countries like Iran become better rocket powers, if you will. And obviously, they have that coveted P5 seat in the United Nations, and just a presence. Oftentimes, a thorn in the eye, but a thorn in the side, but a presence in multilateral organizations that can strongly challenge the West and the U.S. particularly.
Exactly, and I'm glad you mentioned that about the really the P5 seat, because that is one of the 5 permanent seats at the United Nations General or in the Security Council, and of course they can veto any resolution that comes before the Security Council, and that is a tremendous power to have, even if you're not the second or third most powerful country in the world. But it's extremely, extremely important. Well, let's focus a minute on Ukraine. No matter what we say, it'll be out of date by the time we get on the air with this in a few days from now. But how do you view what's going on in Ukraine? And really, this Ukrainian war started a little over a year ago, but it really started back about 2014, did it not? It's been building up, inching forward, ratcheting up, that type of thing. And now it's sort of come to fruition. And of course, as I said, things are not going well for the Russians in Ukraine, that's for sure.
Yes, this really has tipped over the apple cart of international affairs, Russia's foray into Ukraine. And as you know, they've militarized. They've been involved in Ukraine really since 2014. So for many, it's sort of an ongoing war, another phase in the war. From the Ukrainian side, the morale has been amazing. It's historic, and I think it has really kept Ukraine in the fight. What has also kept Ukraine in the fight, quite obviously, is the tremendous support, material, munitions, the political support that the West particularly has shown Ukraine. That has definitely kept Ukraine in the fight. But it's an interesting thing, Bill. And the other day in an interview, President Volodymyr Zelensky, made a point, and I have felt this very strongly since the outbreak of this round of hostilities, that time is the enemy. Time is the enemy. I think the longer this war goes on, the harder and harder it will be for Ukraine to be reconsolidated or survive basically as a viable state. Zelensky himself said that he would have hoped to have had more weapons and material, that because he didn't have more of those things sooner, the Russians have been able to kind of dig in. And so this folly of invading with a poorly prepared military force, they're not supplied, they're not revived as they need to be, Putin's forces. It has cost Russia dearly, but they still have staying power and they have size. And so I think that time really is the great enemy for Ukraine, without some kind of plan for more overt support for Ukraine to prevail on the battlefield. And so I think it's a modern tragedy in the nation state order, when a country can essentially be occupied and pretty much taken off the map. And I think time really doesn't help Ukraine in this regard.
I think you're absolutely right. Yes. And of course, we were talking about the Wagner group and Prigozhin, the leader of that group. And it's quite interesting. He started out as Putin's chef many years ago, had restaurants, I think, in St. Petersburg. And all of a sudden, he became the leader of this gang of mercenaries. And they not only have tentacles in Ukraine, but also through several African countries. Yes. So they've got quite a network out there as far as being able to tap into resources, financial resources in particular. How damaging was it that, well, we don't know what's going on right now. We just heard today that we thought he was in Belarus,
Yeah.
Come to find out, he's not in Belarus. So who knows where he is? And like I said, when the show airs, who knows where he will be? He may be in South America or 6 feet underground. You never know with the way things go over there. But how damaging was it for him to confront Putin and really to I think, diminish Putin's ironclad hold on the Russian military and on the PR in Russia? I mean, he did not look very strong when this guy was marching towards Moscow, and then he stopped and said, "Well, I'm going to Belarus now."
Yeah, I tell you, Bill, I think this is the biggest, the most important chapter in the story of this round of war right now, to date. Yeah, it's obvious to see one, Putin's body language, his own words, and now how he's so visible now, moving about the country. This has to be the worst thing that could have happened to an autocrat. And it also too clearly it reveals that Prigozhin and his Wagner group, they still have enough power, they have enough sway, even in this war in Ukraine, that Putin just couldn't dissolve them. And if he has just dissolved and gotten rid of the principal players, obviously we don't know that. It's not known to the world. But this has to be the worst thing for an autocrat, basically, to be humbled at home in this way. But he couldn't just stamp them out. And so I consider this another chapter in the long saga of Russian domestic politics, Russian Soviet politics, where transitions and sort of the crumbling, the demise of a regime, there's always subterfuge. There's always there are gaps in time, and reporting. We don't know what's going on, and Putin has to feel pretty isolated. And I would believe even other autocrats looking at this, Kim in North Korea, Xi in China, other autocrats have to be wondering, well, what might happen to me.
Exactly. They certainly should. And of course, this gave China pause, I'm sure, because Putin was trying to lure China into supporting their Ukrainian effort. And the Chinese were pretty much on board, except for providing military arms, as I understand it. But it certainly does give them pause. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or a community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our show and you'd like to share it with people, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very unique relationship, one that can really spell life or death for the planet to some degree, and that's the relationship between the United States, Russia, and China. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Gregg Hall is an associate professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. His most recent book is Examining U.S.-China-Russia Foreign Relations, Great Power Politics in a Post-Obama Era. Greg, we're talking about this relationship between the United States, China, and Russia, and it's so important. But thus far, well, let's go back to Ukraine just for a moment, and before we get off that. Thus far, the Ukrainians have fared much better than we thought they were going to. They've been much more resilient. They've resolute in their determination. But domestically here in the United States, we've got challenges, do we not? Because although Joe Biden's been able to hold NATO together very effectively up to this point, you still got fissures here in that a sizable portion of the Republican Party does not want to support Ukraine. Donald Trump is apparently, from all that he has said he's a supporter of Vladimir Putin. You see that there are certain folks, and some Democrats, I'm sure too, who don't want to do it. But how do you keep that coalition together and make sure that it doesn't crack and splinter and have NATO going in all different directions and the support collapse in the United States?
Sure, it could very well happen. Obviously, that and that was really the impetus for doing the follow-up study. Is essentially the changes that were taking place in the respective domestic environments of the big three powers. Of the three, barring some development in Russia that we can't see at the moment, the social and political environment for the United States is really the one that's most up in the air, most uncertain. It's interesting. Even the Republican presidential candidates, they're beginning to visit, obviously, the region. They're beginning to engage with Ukrainian leaders and officials more, and it's very clear that what will emerge in this Republican presidential primary will be a stronger voice for at least slowing down, ratcheting back some of the support for the war effort. This is a major dynamic going into next year, and who knows how this is going to play out. But Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, respectively, the two Republican frontrunners right now, we could expect that in either DeSantis or Trump presidency, it would be a very different situation regarding the U.S. Support for Ukraine and dealings with Russia and other countries on a host of issues. It definitely shows the critical importance of the domestic environment, and particularly for our country.
It certainly does, yes. Well, now if we could shift gears to China, we just bounce around from one country to another. Let's take a look at China, and we could spend 2 days talking about Taiwan. Just briefly, how do you perceive the Taiwanese situation, and what do you think will happen there? And I guess it's a roll of the dice. Nobody knows, but we all have an idea of what we think might happen.
Yeah, well, definitely. In my assessment, Bill, and I'm not alone, the Taiwan Strait issue, and more broadly, the South China Sea contest between China and other smaller players like the Philippines and the U.S. Those are the red line areas. Those are the Taiwan Strait, particularly. Mainland China would fight the U.S. over Taiwan. Questioned, would U.S. fight mainland China over Taiwan? Well, we have this strategic ambiguity doctrine, as you know, that for years that we don't just outright say that we would fight for Taiwan, but we definitely have been major military suppliers and have provided strong diplomatic support, and so this has been long standing. And so that's a red line for sure. And it's probably, of all the conflicts and possible confrontations between the U.S. and China, the one that would spread more widely, more prone to spread throughout the region, and probably even to the homelands of both U.S. and China. So it's a dire situation if it begins to spiral out of control. And I think what the mainland is trying to do is obviously to keep deeply rooted in the domestic politics of Taiwan, and to essentially to have a presence where either of the two major parties is not attempting to get on a path to pull away, but essentially to kind of keep the status quo. But from the Chinese side, the mainland Beijing side, the U.S. is really pushing and aggravating beyond the status quo towards a situation where Taiwan might declare itself independent, which of course that would be for many in Beijing a tripwire.
It certainly would, yes. And recently, although it's slowed down apparently a bit now, you've seen that a lot of Democrats and Republicans have been unified on trying to see who can out-hawk each other on
Yes.
China. They've really kind of gone beyond the bounds of reason in some cases, to be quite honest. But that apparently has slowed down a bit. But now the Secretary of State, Antony, has basically said that we need to decouple from the tensions that we have with China and see if we can slow this down a bit. And so it's just absolutely important that we do that, because if we don't, we could find ourselves hurtling towards some kind of war. But how do you see Antony Blinken's warning to us as far as slowing it down and trying to back off and to move into dialogue as opposed to confrontation?
Yes, he's doing everything he can to dial it back some degrees, making the appropriate statements. It's increasingly clear, particularly after this episode of the balloon a few months ago, the spy balloon. It's increasingly clear that what China wants most, or what Beijing sees as more important in the relationship, the U.S. would like to see something else. I think Beijing really wants to see breakthroughs and have breakthroughs in areas of trade, technology, access to U.S. technology, whereas the U.S. wants just what Secretary Blinken is putting forward, dialed back confidence building measures, military to military contacts. I think right now the U.S. wants that more than anything else in the relationship, military to military affairs, but China's holding out on that, and particularly without progress in areas like the economic relationship, like access to technology. But at least they're talking. Secretary of Treasury, of course, Yellen is there for talks in China, and I think that's basically all that we can expect is talks on multiple levels, and more hopefully even track 2 type arrangements. But it's going to be a long time, a very, very long time, before U.S. and China are going to be able to sit down and talk arms control, and even talk about deconflicting the situation more in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait.
I can't remember exactly. I think it was Sir Winston Churchill who said it's better to jaw than war. Because
Yes.
once you start the war, who knows where it's going to go? There are always unintended consequences, and they never end the way you think they're going to. Ever. Pick a war, it never comes out the way you think it's going to be. So we have to keep moving. But you're right, the arms control situation, it looks rather bleak right now. But on a little bit of positive good news, we see that the United States is going back in. We've gone back into the UN World Health Organization. We are going to repay our arrearages to peacekeeping at some point. I just noticed the other day that we're rejoining UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which is a major agency of the UN system. So there's a lot of positive movement. We're back in the Paris Climate Accords, and these all have to be dealt with. And of course, the big one, the 800-pound gorilla, is going to be whether or not we can get Iran to come back into some kind of an agreement, which when we pulled out and made a drastic mistake a few years ago, pulling out of that Iranian deal, that really set the stage for destabilizing the Middle East to a large degree. But Greg, in our last 30 seconds, what recommendations would you have for our viewers to help us better understand this issue and to get involved in learning what's going on and be actively participating in the outcome?
Certainly, Bill. Well, Bill, I would say you know that I would definitely beat this drum. Where there is a United Nations Association, a UNA that's available, people should get plugged in. That UNAUSA.org, I believe. People should take advantage opportunities in the community to speakers. I did a talk along these lines a few months ago in the Lexington Public Library. And the local universities, the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce here at the University of Kentucky, we're very active. We partner with other departments and in areas like Russian studies to provide talks. And so definitely people need to plug into different sources of information and just get engaged locally for things global.
Exactly. Very good recommendations, Greg. And congratulations on your recent book. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Always a pleasure, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.